They laughed when Ethan Cole took an Apache woman as his wife. By sundown, not one of them remembered how to laugh. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your town or state below, and if you believe justice doesn't always ride with a gun, stay with me. Now listen close. The town of Red Hollow had a way of shrinking men down to what they owned, and Ethan Cole owned almost nothing, just 40 acres of stubborn land, a tired horse, and a silence that made people uneasy. He didn't drink at the saloon, didn't argue at the general store, didn't explain himself to anyone, and that was reason enough for folks to talk. So when he rode in one morning with a woman beside him, dark hair, steady eyes, wearing a silver necklace that caught the sun like it knew something the rest of them didn't, the laughter started before his boots hit the dirt. You marry her? Someone called out, voice thick with mockery. Ethan didn't answer. He just reached up, helped her down from the saddle like she weighed less than the dust on his coat. The woman said nothing either. She looked at the town the way a person looks at weather rolling in, calm, certain, already knowing how it would end. Her name was Ayanna. Nobody asked. They didn't need to. To them, she was just Apache, and that was enough. The preacher hesitated before agreeing to the ceremony, glancing out the window like trouble might be watching, but Ethan stood there steady, hat in his hands, and Ayanna beside him, eyes forward, and whatever passed between them didn't need words. By the time it was done, the town had made up its mind. They whispered when the couple walked by, refused service at the store, turned shoulders at the well. One man laughed loud enough for everyone to hear, said, "You just married yourself into a grave, Cole." Ethan kept walking. That was his way, always had been. But that night, as the wind slid low across the plains and the last light faded behind the ridge, Ayanna stood on the porch of that small ranch house and looked out toward the horizon. The land stretched wide and empty, miles of dust and silence, but her gaze held on something far beyond what any of them could see. Ethan came to stand beside her, boots quiet on the wood. For a while, neither spoke. Then she said it, soft, like it was already decided. They will come. Ethan didn't ask who, didn't ask why. Maybe a part of him already knew that whatever followed this woman had weight to it, something older than fences and town lines. The next morning, the town woke to a sound they couldn't place at first. Not thunder, not wind, something steadier, rhythmic, the kind of sound that doesn't hurry because it doesn't need to. And out past the ridge, where the sky meets the dust, shapes began to form. Small at first, then more, then many. And somewhere in Red Hollow, a man who had laughed the loudest the day before stepped outside, squinting into the rising sun, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that he might have misunderstood something important. The sound grew clearer with every passing minute, not loud, not frantic, just steady, like something that had traveled a long way and had no intention of stopping now. And the people of Red Hollow began stepping out from their doorways one by one, boots settling into the dust, eyes narrowing against the morning light, trying to make sense of what was coming over that ridge. Because this was not the kind of place where anything unexpected arrived without warning, and yet there it was, a line, stretching across the horizon, riders moving as one, not scattered like travelers, not hurried like messengers, but measured, deliberate, as if each mile beneath their horses had already been decided long before today. And near the well, the same man who had laughed the loudest the day before shifted his weight and muttered something under his breath that no one answered, because there was a feeling settling over the town now, something quiet and heavy, like the air before a storm that does not need thunder to be understood. And inside the small house at the edge of town, Ethan Cole stood at the window, his hand resting against the frame worn smooth by years of wind, his eyes fixed on the same distant line, and behind him, Ayanna moved without sound, her steps soft against the wooden floor, the silver necklace at her throat catching a thin line of sunlight as she stepped beside him. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because whatever was coming did not belong to words. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes the past has finally caught up with the present. And still he did not reach for a weapon, did not turn away. He simply stood there, steady as the land beneath his boots. And Ayanna watched the horizon with a calm that did not belong to someone surprised, her eyes following the movement of the riders as if she had been expecting each one, as if she knew their number before they appeared, and outside, the first of the horses crested the ridge, sunlight breaking across leather and dust, revealing figures upright in their saddles, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sky. No shouting, no raised arms, just a quiet arrival that carried more weight than noise ever could, and the townspeople began to gather without being told, drawn by something they could not name, forming a loose line along the main street, some standing with arms crossed, others with hands resting uncertainly at their sides, and the sheriff stepped out last, adjusting his hat, trying to carry the kind of authority that felt smaller with each passing second, because even he could see this was not something he could command, not something he could turn away with a word, and the riders came closer, hooves pressing into the dry earth, kicking up slow drifting clouds of dust that hung in the air like a curtain between what was and what was about to be. And then, just at the edge of town, they stopped, not one step further, not one step back, a perfect line drawn between two worlds, and for a long moment, nothing moved, not the riders, not the townspeople, not even the wind, as if the land itself was holding its breath. And then one rider shifted forward slightly, not aggressive, not hesitant, simply certain, and every eye in Red Hollow followed that single movement, waiting, measuring, wondering what name would be spoken first, because deep down, though none of them would say it out loud, they all understood now that whatever this was, it was not about Ethan Cole, and it was not about the town. It had always been about the woman standing quietly on that porch, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, as if this moment had been walking toward her long before she ever set foot in Red Hollow. No one spoke at first, because the kind of silence that had fallen over Red Hollow was not empty. It was waiting, and the rider at the front moved his horse forward just enough for the light to catch his face. Older than the others, his hair touched with gray, his posture straight not from pride, but from something earned over years that did not need to be explained. And when he looked toward the small ranch at the edge of town, he did not scan the crowd, did not acknowledge the sheriff, did not even glance at the men who had laughed the day before. His eyes went only to the porch, only to her. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not carry like a shout, but it reached every corner of that dusty street, as if the air itself made space for it. Ayanna. And the name settled over the town like something that had been missing and had just found its place. And for a heartbeat, no one moved, not even the horses, as if the world needed to hear it twice to believe it. And then it came again, not louder, but deeper, spoken by another rider, then another, until the sound of her name passed through the line like wind through tall grass, steady, unified, undeniable. And on the porch, Ayanna did not flinch, did not step back. She simply exhaled, slow, measured, as if a weight she had been carrying had finally reached the ground, and Ethan stood beside her, feeling something shift in the air that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding, because he could see it now, not in the number of riders, not in the way they had arrived, but in the way they waited, not for permission, not for confrontation, but for her. And behind him, the wood of the house creaked softly in the heat, a small sound against something much larger unfolding. And down in the street, the man who had laughed the loudest felt his throat tighten, not from threat, but from the sudden realization that he had mistaken quiet for weakness, that he had looked at a woman and seen only what he expected, not what stood before him. And the sheriff shifted his stance, hand hovering near his belt before slowly falling away, because there was nothing here that could be settled with force, nothing that answered to authority the way he understood it. And the rider at the front lowered his gaze just slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed if not for the way every other rider remained perfectly still behind him. And then, with a motion that carried more weight than any command, he swung one leg over and stepped down from his horse, boots touching the ground with care, not hesitation, but respect, and he walked forward alone, each step measured, each movement deliberate, until he reached the edge of the town line, stopping just short of crossing it. And there he stood, waiting, and all eyes turned back to the porch, to the woman who had not moved since her name was first spoken, the silver necklace at her throat catching the sun once more, a small glint that seemed to draw the morning light toward it. And for a long moment, nothing happened, not because there was nothing to do, but because everything that mattered had already been decided somewhere far beyond the reach of Red Hollow. And then Ayanna took a single step forward, the wood beneath her feet giving a soft sound, and Ethan felt it before he understood it, that whatever came next did not belong to him to lead. And yet he did not step away, did not lower his gaze. He remained beside her, not as a shield, not as a voice, but as something quieter, something steadier. And down in the dust, the rider lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, every person in that town realized they were not watching strangers meet. They were watching something return, something that had been separated not by distance, but by time, and the weight of it pressed into the silence so deeply that even the wind seemed to hold back, waiting for her to speak, waiting for what she would decide to become the truth that all of them would have to live with. The distance between them held for one breath longer than anyone expected, and then Ayanna stepped down from the porch, not hurried, not hesitant, her boots touching the dry wood, then the dust, each step quiet, but carrying farther than any voice in Red Hollow ever had. And Ethan followed one pace behind, not leading, not stopping her, just there, steady as he had always been, and the townspeople shifted without meaning to, creating space in the street as she walked, as if something in them understood this was not a path meant to be blocked. And the rider who had spoken her name straightened slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, his hands resting loose at his sides, his eyes never leaving hers. And when she reached the edge of the town line, she stopped, the same invisible boundary he had respected now holding between them. And for a moment they simply stood, the past and the present meeting in a place that did not belong to either one completely. And then the man inclined his head, slow, deliberate, a gesture that carried meaning older than any building in that town, and behind him, as if moved by the same unseen signal, every rider followed, not dismounting, not speaking, just lowering their heads in unison, a line of stillness stretching across the horizon, and the sound that passed through Red Hollow was not a voice, not a command, but something quieter, the sound of certainty breaking against the edges of doubt. And Ayanna lifted her hand slightly, not high, not for show, just enough, and the riders held where they were, as if the smallest motion from her was enough to guide them. And Ethan watched it all without turning his head, his eyes forward, his breathing even, but something in his chest had shifted, something he had carried for years settling into a place he had not known was waiting. And behind them, a whisper moved through the townspeople, not bold, not loud, just a thread of realization weaving through the crowd, because the story they had told themselves about her was falling apart in front of them, piece by piece, and none of them knew how to gather it back together. And the sheriff took a step forward, then stopped, the weight of his badge suddenly feeling smaller than the moment unfolding before him. And the man who had laughed the loudest lowered his eyes, his hands no longer sure where to rest, because the ground beneath him felt different now, not the same dirt he had stood on the day before, but something that had shifted just enough to remind him that he had never truly owned it. And Ayanna's voice came then, soft, steady, not raised, but carried. "You came far." And the rider answered just as quietly, "We come where you stand." And there was no pride in it, no display, just truth spoken without the need to prove itself. And a breeze moved through the street, lifting a thin veil of dust that passed between them like a curtain being drawn back. And in that space, Ethan saw something he had not expected, not tension, not threat, but recognition, the kind that does not need to be earned in the moment because it was decided long before. And Ayanna's gaze shifted for the first time, not away, but slightly, enough to include him in it, and the rider's eyes followed, resting on Ethan with a weight that measured without judging. And for a long second, the world seemed to narrow to that single line between two men who had never met, and yet stood connected by something neither had named. And then Ayanna spoke again. Quieter still, he gave water, and the words settled into the air, simple, unadorned, but carrying more weight than any explanation could. And the rider's expression changed, not sharply, not visibly to all, but enough, a subtle easing, a shift that passed through the line behind him like a ripple across still water. And the silence that followed was no longer waiting, it was deciding, and every person in Red Hollow felt it, that whatever happened next would not come from force, would not come from fear, but from her. and her alone. The words did not echo, they settled, like something placed carefully on a table where no one dared to move too quickly. And the rider held Ayana's gaze a moment longer before nodding once, not as a command, not as submission, but as acknowledgement, and then he stepped back, just a single pace, returning the space to her, and that small movement carried across the line of riders behind him, shoulders easing, reins loosening, the tension that had never shown itself now quietly dissolving into something steadier, something grounded. And in the town, men who had stood with arms crossed now found their hands lowering without realizing it, boots shifting in the dust as if the ground itself had softened beneath them, and the sheriff exhaled. Slowly, the weight in his chest easing though he could not say why, because nothing had been resolved in the way he understood resolution, no law spoken, no authority declared, and yet something had already changed, something deeper than rules, and Ayana turned then, not away from the riders, but slightly, enough that her shoulder faced Ethan, her presence still rooted in both directions at once. And for the first time since the riders had appeared, her eyes softened, just a fraction, enough for Ethan to see what no one else could, that this moment was not just about who she was to them, but who she had chosen to be here, beside him. And Ethan did not speak, did not reach for her. He simply stood as he always had, steady, unyielding, but now with a quiet understanding settling into his posture, that whatever had brought her into his life had not been chance, and whatever stood before them now was not something to fear. And behind them, the man who had laughed shifted again, clearing his throat, the sound small and uncertain, because the words he had spoken the day before no longer seemed to belong to him, as if they had been said by someone else, someone who had not seen what he was seeing now. And near the well, a woman who had turned her back the day before now watched with her hands clasped tight, her eyes moving between Ayana and the riders, trying to find a place to set her understanding, and finding none. And the breeze picked up again, carrying the scent of dry earth and leather, brushing past the town as if it had somewhere else to be. And in that movement, Ayana lifted her hand once more, a small gesture, but this time different, not to hold, but to guide. And the rider at the front nodded again, deeper now, and turned slightly, his body angling back toward the line behind him, and one by one, without command, without sound, the riders shifted, not retreating, not leaving, but repositioning, creating a path that opened away from the town, wide and clear, as if they were making space not for themselves, but for her decision. And the message moved through the silence without needing words, that they had come, that they had seen, and that what came next would not be taken. It would be chosen. And Ayana looked down that open path for a long moment, the horizon stretching out beyond it, familiar in a way that touched something deep in her, something older than the house behind her, older than the town that had judged her. And then she turned back, fully now, her body facing Ethan, the porch, the land that had taken her in without question. And the riders did not move, did not press, they simply waited, as if the strength they carried was not in what they could do, but in what they were willing to leave untouched. And Ethan met her eyes, not asking, not expecting, just present. And in that quiet exchange, something passed between them that no one else could read, something that did not need to be spoken because it had already been lived. And Ayana lowered her hand slowly, the gesture complete, and the path behind her remained open, but untouched. And the riders understood, because they did not close it, did not question it, they simply accepted it, the same way they had accepted her word before it was spoken. And in Red Hollow, the silence that followed was not heavy anymore. It was clear, like a sky after a storm that never broke. And for the first time since they had arrived, a man in the town removed his hat, not out of fear, not out of habit, but out of something quieter, something closer to respect, though he would not yet call it that. The dust settled slowly along the open path, drifting in thin lines that caught the morning light. And for a while no one moved, not because they could not, but because something in the moment asked them not to rush it. And Ethan stood beside Ayana with the same quiet stillness he had carried since the first day she stepped onto his land, his hands relaxed at his sides, his eyes steady. But now there was something else there, something that had not been there before, not fear, not doubt, but a kind of understanding that comes only when a man realizes the world is larger than the fences he builds around it. and Ayana remained facing him, the silver necklace resting against her collarbone, rising and falling with each breath, a small movement that seemed to anchor everything else around it and behind her. The riders waited without impatience, their horses shifting lightly, leather creaking softly in the heat. But no one spoke, no one urged, because whatever decision was being made did not belong to them to hurry. And in the town, people who had spent years speaking quickly now found themselves unable to say anything at all, their thoughts catching in their throats, because the story they had told themselves no longer fit what they were seeing. And near the edge of the crowd, the man who had laughed lifted his hand slightly, as if to say something, but the words never came, his mouth closing again as he looked down at the dust beneath his boots, as if searching for something he had lost there. And the sheriff removed his hat this time without thinking, holding it in both hands, his posture softening, not from weakness, but from the quiet recognition that authority had nothing to do with what stood before him. And a woman near the well took a step forward, then another, her eyes fixed on Ayana, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to curiosity, as if she was seeing her for the first time without the weight of her own assumptions. And the wind moved again, carrying a faint scent of sage from somewhere beyond the ridge, a reminder that the land stretched far beyond Red Hollow, far beyond what any of them could claim. And Ayana turned her head slightly, just enough to look back toward the riders, her gaze passing over them not as a leader counting numbers, but as someone recognizing faces, histories, bonds that had not been broken, only paused. And then she looked back at Ethan, and in that quiet exchange, something settled, something chosen, and Ethan gave the smallest nod, not because he understood everything, but because he understood enough, and that was all that mattered. And Ayana stepped back toward the porch, one step, then another, her boots leaving faint impressions in the dust that would not last long, but marked the path all the same. And the riders did not follow, did not close the space. They simply watched, and when she reached the porch, she placed her hand lightly against the wooden rail, the grain worn smooth by years of weather. And for a moment she rested there, her fingers still, her presence rooted, and then she turned fully toward the house, toward the life she had stepped into without promise, without certainty. And behind her, the rider at the front drew in a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling, and he lifted his hand, not high, not commanding, just enough, and the line of riders responded as one, turning their horses with quiet precision, the movement smooth, unhurried, as if they had already known this would be the outcome. And the open path remained open, untouched, a choice offered, and left behind. And as the riders began to move away, the sound of hooves returned, not heavy, not pressing, just steady, carrying them back across the ridge from where they had come. And in Red Hollow, no one spoke, not yet, because the silence that remained was no longer empty. It was full of something new, something that had taken root in the space where judgment had once lived. And on the porch, Ayana stood beside Ethan, her gaze forward, her posture calm, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. And the town, for the first time in a long while, did not know what to say, and that silence, more than anything else, began to tell the truth. The sound of hooves faded beyond the ridge, slow at first, then softer, until it became something the wind could carry away. And when it was gone, truly gone, the quiet that remained felt different than any silence Red Hollow had known before, not heavy, not tense, but open, like a door that had never been there had just been left ajar. And for a long moment, no one moved, as if each person was waiting for someone else to explain what had just happened, but no explanation came, and that absence began to settle deeper than any answer could. And Ethan turned slightly, the wood of the porch creaking beneath his boots, his eyes moving across the town, not searching, not challenging, just observing, the same way he had always done. But now the way people looked back at him had changed, subtle, uncertain, like they were seeing a different man standing in the same place. And Ayana remained beside him, her posture unchanged, her gaze calm, as if the morning had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. And near the well, the woman who had stepped forward earlier took another step, then another, until she stood at the edge of the open space between the town and the ranch, her hands no longer clenched, her shoulders no longer tight, and she looked up at Ayana with something fragile in her expression, not apologies spoken aloud, but something close to it, something still learning how to take shape, and she gave the smallest nod, uncertain, but real, and Ayana returned it, just as small, just as quiet. And that simple exchange carried farther than any words could have. Because it did not demand attention, it earned it. And behind her, the man who had laughed the loudest shifted again, his boots scuffing the dirt as he stepped forward a few inches, then stopped, his hat still in his hand, turning it slowly as if it held answers it did not. And for a moment, he looked like he might speak, but instead, he lowered his head slightly, not to anyone in particular, just enough to mark that something inside him had moved, something he did not yet understand, and the sheriff placed his hat back on, but not with the same firmness as before, his hand lingering on the brim as he looked toward Ethan, then toward Ayana, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his gaze, no weighing of authority, just a quiet acceptance that some things did not belong to his badge, and the wind moved again, lighter now, brushing across the town as if it had nothing left to carry away, and in that movement, a boy who had been standing near the edge of the crowd took a step forward, then another, his small boots leaving uneven prints in the dust, and he looked up at Ethan, then at Ayana, his eyes wide not with fear, but with curiosity unshaped by the words of others, and he held out a small tin cup, empty, his hand trembling just slightly from the weight of the moment, and Ethan looked at the cup, then at the boy, and without a word, he turned, stepped inside, and returned with a canteen, filling the cup slowly, the water catching the light as it poured, a simple act, quiet, familiar, and the boy took it with both hands, nodding once before stepping back, and no one laughed, no one spoke, because the meaning of that moment did not need to be explained. It stood on its own, clear and steady, and Ayana watched it all with the same calm presence, her eyes softening just a fraction, as if something in that small gesture echoed something deeper, something remembered, and Ethan stepped back beside her, placing the canteen on the porch rail, his hand resting there for a second longer than necessary, and as the town slowly began to move again, not back to what it had been, but forward into something quieter, something more careful. The space between people felt different, less certain, but more honest, and no one said it out loud. No one needed to. But in the way they stood, in the way they looked, in the way they chose their silence, Red Hollow had begun to understand that what they had witnessed was not something that had come to change the land. It had come to reveal it. By late afternoon, the town had begun to breathe again, not the same way it had before, not with the loose certainty that came from thinking you understood everything, but slower, more careful, like each step now carried a weight it had not carried that morning. And the sun hung low over the ridge, casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt road and touched the porch where Ethan and Ayana stood, the light turning the silver at her throat into something softer, less like a signal and more like a memory, and people moved through their routines in quiet ways, doors opening and closing without slamming, voices kept low, eyes lingering a second longer than usual when they passed by the edge of Ethan's land, and near the well, the same woman who had stepped forward earlier filled her bucket, then paused, looking toward the ranch, her grip loosening slightly on the handle as if she was deciding something small but important. And after a moment, she lifted the bucket and began walking, not toward her own home, but across the open space, her steps steady, though her shoulders held a trace of uncertainty, and when she reached the fence, she stopped, resting the bucket on the ground, her hands brushing against her skirt before she looked up, meeting Ayana's eyes for just a second, and then she nodded again, this time more certain, and turned back without a word, leaving the water where it stood. A simple gesture, but one that did not ask for recognition. And on the porch, Ethan watched it without comment, his gaze following the woman only until she reached the road again, then returning to the land beyond, where the horizon had gone quiet once more, and Ayana stepped down from the porch, her boots pressing into the soft dust, moving toward the fence where the bucket waited, and she bent slightly, her hand brushing the handle, not lifting it right away, just resting there as if feeling the weight of what had been offered, and then she picked it up, turning back toward the house, her movement unhurried, unforced, and Ethan opened the door before she reached it, stepping aside to let her pass. the gesture small, familiar, but carrying something new beneath it, something earned, and inside. The light fell differently now, softer through the window, touching the rough wood of the table, the worn edges of the chairs, the simple things that had once defined the limits of Ethan's world, and Ayanna set the bucket down near the wall, the sound of water settling inside it the only noise in the room. And for a moment they stood there, not speaking, not needing to, because the silence between them was no longer empty. It was shared, and outside, the town continued its quiet shift, the man who had laughed passing by the general store with his hat still in his hands, pausing just long enough to glance toward the ranch before lowering his eyes again, and the sheriff leaning against the post outside his office, not watching for trouble, but simply watching, as if he was learning something he had never been taught. And the boy with the tin cup returned to his place near the edge of the street, holding it tighter now, not because it was empty, but because it was his, something given without question, and the wind carried the last traces of dust from the riders passing far beyond the ridge, leaving the sky clear, open, untouched, and as the sun dipped lower, the long shadows softened, blending into the ground until they were no longer separate, and in that fading light, Red Hollow did not return to what it had been. It did not need to, because what had changed was not the buildings, not the land, but the way people stood upon it, the way they chose to see what was in front of them. And on the porch, as evening settled in, Ethan and Ayanna stepped back outside, standing side by side, not as something to be judged, not as something to be explained, but simply as they were. And for the first time since the morning began, the town did not look at them with questions. It looked at them with something quieter, something that did not need words to be understood. The night settled over Red Hollow without announcement, the way it always had, but it did not feel the same. The air cooler, the light fading slower as if the day itself was reluctant to leave what it had witnessed behind, and lamps began to glow one by one along the street, soft yellow against the deepening blue, casting quiet halos that did not reach far, but reached enough. And on the porch, Ethan leaned lightly against the post, his hat low, his gaze resting somewhere beyond the fence, not watching for anything, just letting the land settle back into itself. And beside him, Ayanna stood with her hands folded loosely, her shoulders relaxed, her presence as steady as the ground beneath them. And for a long time, neither spoke, because the kind of understanding that had formed between them did not need words to hold it together. And out in the town, doors closed gently, not slammed, voices softened, not raised. And where there had been laughter the day before, there was now something quieter, something that lingered just beneath the surface of every movement. And near the well, the woman who had left the bucket earlier paused before going inside, turning once more toward the ranch, her eyes resting there for a second longer than necessary before she stepped through her door. And the man who had laughed sat alone on the edge of the boardwalk, his hat resting in his lap, his fingers tracing the brim without thought, as if trying to understand the shape of something he could not yet name. And the sheriff stood in the doorway of his office, arms folded, not guarding, not judging, just watching the street as it emptied, his gaze drifting once toward the edge of town, then back again, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice stretching across the open land, a reminder that the world beyond Red Hollow had not changed, that it had never needed to. And inside the house, the small bucket of water sat near the wall, still and clear, reflecting the faint light from the window. And when Ethan finally spoke, his voice was low, almost part of the night itself. "You could have gone with them." And Ayanna did not answer right away, her eyes lifting toward the horizon where the last line of light had faded. And when she spoke, it was just as quiet. "I know." And there was no regret in it, no hesitation, just truth. And Ethan nodded once, not because he needed confirmation, but because he understood what that choice meant without needing it explained. And the wind moved softly across the porch, brushing past them, carrying with it the scent of earth that had cooled after the day. And Ayanna reached up, her fingers touching the silver necklace for just a moment, not holding it, not adjusting it, just acknowledging its presence. And then her hand fell back to her side, and the silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. It was fuller, steadier, something built rather than something left empty. And out in the town, a window opened slightly, then another, letting the night air in, letting something else out, something unspoken, and the boy with the tin cup placed it beside his bed before lying down, his eyes closing slowly, not with confusion, but with a quiet certainty that the world was larger than he had thought that morning. And as the hours passed, Red Hollow did not return to what it had been. It did not forget. It did not pretend. It simply moved forward, step by step, carrying what it had learned without needing to say it out loud. And on the porch, long after the last light had gone, Ethan and Ayanna remained, side by side, looking out over the same land that had once divided people into names and lines and distance, and now held something else entirely, something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself. And in that stillness, with no witnesses left to see it, no voices left to shape it, the truth of the day settled into the ground beneath them, not as a story to be told, but as something to be lived and out. Here, where the wind carried more than words ever could, justice did not arrive with noise. It arrived like this, slow, certain, and silent.